Welcome to the life and secret teachings of Jesus the Christ. It was in 1970 that Jesus appeared to me for the first time. This was to change my life drastically and send me on that long search to find the missing pieces that are not commonly written about. I wondered where he had been between 3 and 12 and where he'd been between 12 and 30. This was to cover some of the greatest libraries of the world. Finally, after 20 years, the pieces of the giant puzzle have been put together. Please join me on this very exciting journey. Welcome to another episode of Mystic Christianity. Of course, I'm your hostess, Elizabeth MacDonald Burrows. We left off last week just touching Jesus' sevenfold path of peace, peace with the mind. And that's where we're going today. If you remember, these 7 communions were to be given at high noon. It is because between 11 or 12, or when the sun is high in the sky, that everything is so quiet and so still that it is easy for a person to go inward and to experience the deep contemplative thought of, as Jesus outlined, the sevenfold path of peace. We had the communions with the angels of the earthly mother, which will be coming later, that Jesus taught, which we communed with in the morning, so that our day would be a regenerative day and a positive time and a time of joy. Then, of course, at the very end of the series, we will be touching his communions with the angels of the Heavenly Father, which was such things as love and power and wisdom, so that we can strengthen our lives, that we can be more loving, most of all, to understand why we should be. But he wanted his disciples to have this communion with God morning, noon, and night. And for this reason, he collected this high noon, or 11 to 12 rather, when the sun was high in the sky, for this great and quiet peace. So as we move on with peace with the mind, we need to remember that thoughts are things. That every thought that we think is an idea in form. If we think of houses, we actually create a thought form in the shape of a house that perhaps we were looking at in order to buy. It's hard for us to imagine that thoughts are so powerful, but we have all been the target at some time or other of someone being angry at us, and we know how unhappy that makes us feel. So Jesus knew that until we had peace with the mind, we would never have peace with the body. We would never cease our wars. We would never cease the antagonism against our neighbors. And he is trying to point out, as he goes into this part of the sevenfold path of peace, how to improve our minds and what our thoughts do. And since we have proven beyond all doubt that Jesus studied, of course, in India, according certainly to the Pali Scroll, we have also the translation of the letter that he wrote his mother when he came from Egypt, which was at the very end of the lost years and brought him back into Israel. I think in order to understand the tremendous universality that Jesus had, we have to understand where he studied. Not only did he know the Jewish law, or the doctors, shall I say, the law of Moses, but he also understood the ways of the East. And he understood the ways of the mystery schools of Egypt. We're going to take a look at this today because part of training the mind to think in a more positive way is to train the mind to see things differently, so that in every act of nature we see something beautiful, and most of all that we can see God in all mankind. It takes practice. It is not something that comes to us easily and not always naturally. And yet our very interior, which is God himself, that very interior is love and power and wisdom. So in order for us to come to our real true nature, we have to overcome these things that bring us hatred and anger and jealousy and impatience, Jesus wrote on peace with the mind, "Then shall the Son of Man seek peace with his own thoughts, that the angel of wisdom may guide him. For I tell you truly, there is no greater power in heaven and earth than the thoughts of the Son of Man." Why would he say that there is no greater power in heaven and earth than the thoughts of the Son of Man? That means our thoughts are much more powerful than we ever imagined. And we do so much damage to ourselves by these thought forces that we create, because like draws like. If we think with terms of hatred, we receive hatred, and we destroy ourselves. We become a vessel full of anger and animosity and hatred. We don't want to live that way. He went on, "Though unseen in the eyes of the body, yet each thought has mighty strength, even such strength as can shake the heavens." And I feel like I'm going to tell you a little story here. Of course, my entire pursuit has been toward oneness with God, or at least certainly to see and to know Him. And in recent years, to search for oneness with not only Him, but a unity with earth. But early in my pursuit and transformational change, I got very angry at God, and so I kind of told Him off. I looked up into the heavens, and I envisioned great light, and I went right in the center of this light. And all of a sudden, a very powerful voice spoke to me and said, "This has never been done before." I thought about this for a moment, and I said to the voice, "Which would you have me do? Worship God and serve Him 7 days a week, from early morning until I fall asleep exhausted at night, and love Him and tell Him off, or to just go to church on Sunday and be a good girl?" The voice returned and said, "Well spoken." So I think in terms of that thought of mine, of agitation toward God, was powerful enough to reach right into the interior angelic kingdom. That's how powerful our thoughts are. No, I never did that again, but it leaves me with a fond memory in some ways. "For no other creature," he says, "in the kingdom of the earthly mother is it given the power of thought. For all beasts that crawl and birds that fly live not of their own thinking, but of the one law that governs all. Only the sons of man is given the power of thought, even that thought which can break the bonds of death. Do not think, because it cannot be seen, that thought has no power. I tell you truly," and I want all of you to listen to these next words of Jesus very closely. Oh, how we do create suffering for ourselves just by the way we think and the way we act, but our actions are a reflection of our thoughts. He said, "I tell you truly, the lightning that cleaves a mighty oak, or the quaking that opens a crack in the earth, these are as plays of children compared to the power of thought." So our thoughts are more powerful than earthquakes and lightning. No wonder we send ourselves down a path of destruction by wrong thinking. I tell you truly, each thought of darkness, whether it be of malice or anger or vengeance, these wreak destruction like a fire burning through dry kindling on a windless sky. But man does not see the carnage, nor does he hear the piteous cries of his victims. But when this power is guided by the holy wisdom, then the thoughts of the Son of Man lead him to the heavenly kingdom, and thus it is that paradise is built upon earth. So thus, by proper thinking and right thoughts, we can build a paradise upon earth, a heaven on earth, because all things around us will be things of love. It said, then it is that your thoughts uplift the soul of man as the cold waters of a rushing stream revive your body in the summer heat. So that when we think positive, we uplift all those that are around us. And more importantly, we are one in this universe of the stars. And every positive thought raises the entire universe. And every destructive thought hurts it. And everyone that we know and everyone that we don't know. When first a fledgling bird tries to fly, his wings cannot support him, and he falls again and again to earth. But he tries again, and one day he soars aloft, leaving earth and his nest far behind. So it is that when we first try to think positive thoughts, it's very difficult. And our positive thoughts should not be forced thoughts, but to just simply catch ourselves when we are thinking a wrong thought and think, I must not think this way, because all children are children of God. All children are of the one power of the universe. And if I am unkind to them, it is as if I'm being unkind to God. And what we want is for that divine power in everyone, the Christ in all mankind, to come forth and to rule over the kingdom forever. But he says, but he tries again, and one day he soars aloft. So we try and we try again. And some of the tools that we use in building up more positive thinking is to observe what we read, what we watch. For instance, we should listen to good music, music that uplifts us, makes us soar in the heavens. One day, you'll be able to free your consciousness from the consciousness of the embodiment, that it can meld with God and experience being one and bring all these memories back to earth. This will happen again and again as you go through transformational change. And not only that, but what we watch, what we read, we should read the books of the greatest wisdoms, or books that are free of carnality and violence. We should not participate in those things that would create in us thoughts of carnality and violence. So it is with the thoughts of man. The longer he walks with the angels and keeps her law, the longer his thoughts become one with the holy wisdom. Blessed is he who is wise in mind, for he shall create heaven. The mind of the wise is a well-plowed field which gives forth abundance and plenty. I like that expression because that's what I look at, the mind. We've planted beautiful flowers there throughout our education and perhaps our growth. And when we see something of beauty, we may stop a moment and say, oh, how magnificent is the mountain covered with snow. That beautiful thought is there, as well as our bad thoughts. But these bad thoughts creep in, and they're kind of like weeds. And I remember one morning many years ago, over a quarter of a century ago, that the angelic kingdom would have me up at 5:30 in the morning pulling weeds out in the garden. And I found that interesting because it was very difficult to get me out to pull weeds. It's not something any of us really enjoy. And while I was pulling these in the early morning hours, they taught me that thoughts are like weeds. They get in with the beautiful flowers, and then we have to untangle them. And I think if there was one thing that came to mind stronger than any other, was the morning glory. Because a morning glory just winds around everything until it chokes it out. And it looks beautiful. The flowers of the morning glory are exquisitely beautiful. But nevertheless, it chokes out life. And that's what we do. We see things, we hear things, and at the moment they're very beautiful. And we allow these weeds to come into our garden, and then they begin to choke out the beauty in us until finally it's choked it out completely. But the morning glory, if we unravel it back from the flower, gently, we can disengage it. When we get down to the roots, it isn't very hard to pull the root of a morning glory out once it's untangled from the blooms. And so that's what our mind reminds us of, this field in which we have planted seed. And then all of a sudden we're allowing the weeds to grow up, and they appear beautiful. We can't seem to discern between the flower and the weed. For if you show a handful of seed to a wise man, he will see in his mind's eye a field of golden wheat. And if you show a handful of seeds to a fool, he will see only that which is before him, and he'll call them worthless pebbles. And as the field of a wise man gives forth grain in abundance, the field of the fool is a harvest of only stones. Here, Jesus points out that if we will plant that which is good, what we will bear inside of us will be a great abundance. People around us will be more loving because we are. They will be happier because we bring that with us. It emanates from us. A fool who allows the weeds to grow, eventually it stamps out all that is good and beautiful. And pretty soon no one wants them around because the person is negative and because they're a pessimist. And so Jesus said, so it is with our own thoughts. The same way as it was with the wheat. As a sheaf of golden wheat lies hidden in a tiny kernel, so is the kingdom of heaven hidden within our thoughts. I'm always reminded when Jesus speaks of the kingdom of heaven, we always look up at the blue sky or the night sky filled with stars, and we think heaven is up there someplace, and we ask ourselves, which one of those planets is heaven? And we don't know out of 155 billion galaxies. We really don't know. So heaven must be a state of consciousness that's in us, not something that we go sailing up to the sky to get to. If our thoughts be filled with power and love and wisdom of the angels of the Heavenly Father, so shall they carry us to the heavenly sea. But if they be stained with corruption, hatred, and ignorance, they shall chain our feet to pillars of pain and suffering. I remember my very human life as it was before I met God walking on my path 26 years ago. I thought I was happy at least some of the time. But I can assure you that the happiness that I know today makes the happiness of human life but a shadow. Almost an empty shadow, but not quite. No man can serve two masters. So we can't serve hatred and love. We can't serve weakness and strength. Neither can evil thoughts abide in a mind which is filled with the light of the law. And by this he's not talking just about the Holy Scripture. He's talking about the light of the law, meaning that divine ray that comes from God himself. In other words, that Christ consciousness, the light of consciousness. Because all things which are good are of the light, and all things which are negative are of darkness. So when he speaks of the light of the law, he's talking about the good of the law. He who has found peace with the mind has learned to soar. And catch this, he who has found peace with the mind has learned to soar beyond the realm of angels, meaning even further than the angels. What exists further than the angels? Archangels, the light consciousness, the Christ consciousness, the light of God, and God himself, or herself, depending which way you like it. I tell you truly, that day will come when the thoughts of men will overcome even the kingdom of death. and soar to everlasting life in heavenly kingdoms. For with their thoughts guided by holy wisdom, the sons of men build a bridge of light, thereby to reach God. I'm going to the blackboard and kind of draw a haphazard diagram here to help you understand why Jesus spoke this way. The first thing we're going to do on the blackboard, of course, is to draw a line. And this line is going to separate the world of higher thought from the world of lower thought. We're going to put a head, because we always think in terms of the mind and being inside of our head. Actually, it's the brain that's inside of our head, and it is the soul which, in using the brain or using the mind through the soul, or I'm sorry, not through the soul, but the soul using the mind through the brain, we'll get there in just a moment, that puts everything into operation. After all, our brain is nothing but a physical piece of instrument. It dies when the body dies, disintegrates to dust along with the rest of the body. So it is obvious that this force, this power which we really are, is what's using the brain. I want to show you what is considered lower thought planes and higher thought planes. And I won't focus too much on them because we are all human and we must deal with our human life. That we think of our human problems is not necessarily bad because we have to work them out. It's how we approach our problems that's important. So first, I equate carnal and violence. One breeds the other, so it's very difficult to say which one is the worst, because carnality breeds violence, violence breeds carnality, and so every thought now that we think, and I'm going to put, this is a poor replica of the brain, I assure you, but it's the best I can do. So we saw a similar one with Charlie last week when we looked at Peace with the Body. So here we are with the brain, and I put in these just little cells that comprise the brain, like we have cells that comprise the body. But our thoughts coming through, which is coming through the brain itself, a thought, is going to be joined by like. So if we have a thought which is full of carnality and violence, we then link, and this is like a mighty river, because all the collective thoughts of all the carnality and violence that has belonged to all mankind since the very beginning of human life exists in this great river, which is called the carnal and violence, the collective thoughts of all carnal thoughts and all violent thoughts. Beyond that, we have always our materialism, and materialism is not based upon just yachts and fine cars and things like this. Materialism belongs in every walk of life, even among the poverty. Because we will see someone sometimes with food stamp, and you look in their grocery baskets and there'll be Coca-Cola and Twinkies and kind of the delightful things that they have missed all month. But food for the body, nourishing food and food that will make it healthy, may be void out of that basket. So even in the poorest levels, the wino, he will do anything for his bottle of wine. We understand he's addicted. We're not condemning him because of this. But I'm simply saying materialism exists in every level of life, even that which is poverty. And so we need to not have too much and not too little. It is believed by the Essenes, and certainly Jesus was affiliated with them for many years, till he was 19 years of age, that it was wrong to be either too rich or too poor. Because we should be able to bridge the world between poverty and ourselves, or rich and ourselves. We should be comfortable with all people upon earth. So materialism is going into excess to have more than what we need. There are so many things that we need to take care of. We have the poor, we have the poverty, the homeless, the orphans, the hungry. And so we need to not take so much for ourselves, but give more back to help those who cannot help themselves. Then we look at our attachments. These thoughts, and what I've put here, this line, it simply represents the thought gravity field of Earth. This doesn't mean our thoughts of attachment, our human love, and with husband and wife, or with mother and children, and all this is wrong. It just means that it belongs in the earthly frame of thinking. So that none of these thoughts are quite high enough to reach in the higher cosmic ocean of thought. Probably if we were to come, the closest to good thinking would be the parent and the child, because that is probably the most unconditional love. No matter what the child may do, the parents somehow usually always love the child throughout thick and thin. They may not love each other through thick and thin, but their children they will. So I classify the closest to divine love probably as a love between a parent and a child. But there are many thoughts. We have a lot of anger and hatred that are affiliated with our attachments. And all of these go into cosmic oceans or cosmic streams of hatred, discourse, anger. Because when we have a thought of anger, we link with all of the thoughts of anger that has ever been thought upon earth. We get angrier and angrier and angrier because we had opened a doorway which just allows a great flood to roll in. So when we find ourselves getting this way, we must learn to change it. And so for this reason, we try to, at least I certainly try to teach the student to listen to good music, to read good books, to be careful what they watch on television, and to constantly search for God. I have 3 rules which I ask my students to abide by. One is to meditate only on God. The next is to read only the works of the great wisdoms. And the third is to live as the masters lived. But up here, beyond this realm of what we would call these lower thoughts, are the higher thoughts of the angelic and archangelic. Every one who has ever lived, who has gone through the resurrection of the dead and transcended their human life, which we call mastership over life, they have and still contain their wisdom. Their souls are still alive. There is no death. So the mind which is reading great books, like for instance, let us say we're reading about Jesus. And I certainly have read a lot about Jesus over a quarter of a century. If we think about him, then we start to pierce the innermost roads of his consciousness because he is still alive. Everything that he taught, everything that he believed, everything that he created, all this is still with him. And we become the recipients. Of course, each of us are going to understand it at our own level of understanding, because Jesus had his he had his adepts first, and adepts such as John the Baptist and John the Beloved and the apostles and disciples and Paul and all of those, which were his adepts. From his adepts, he had his initiates. Initiates meant those like his disciples were at first before they served him, when they were initiated into the way he taught, initiated into his life so that they would begin to live as he lived. And here is a kind of a doorway. It's almost like the doorway that we will look at in the Via Dolorosa. But this doorway, where many are called and few are chosen, every great wisdom who has ever lived fits more or less the same description, because they do have their followers. I mean, Pythagoras, Plato. In fact, they said if Jesus had not advented, our world would be today Platonic, or believing in the religion of Plato or the philosophy of Plato. Then we have what we classify here, the probationers, those who have stepped beyond the ranks of traditional Christianity, or shall I say formalized Christian church, to try to really pierce the inroads of Jesus' teachings. So we're going to understand at whatever level, but nevertheless our mind links with the consciousness of that particular person. This means that all of the great mathematicians, the great astronomers, the great historians, the great mathematicians, the great scientists, all these have formed great pools of wisdom in what we refer to in modern time kind of as the cosmic ocean, the body of God. And they all exist because the consciousness and soul of the great wisdom exists. And you're going to hear more about this when we go into Peace with Ancient Culture, because Jesus taught that we need to have respect for the wisdoms of the past. And certainly he studied them. So we have a wealth of knowledge. Just imagine what it would be like in our school systems today if by chance we had someone failing in the world of mathematics. And we brought out one of the great mathematicians, taught this youngster the life of the mathematician, began to have him work the same problems that the mathematician worked. Well, I think you would be quite surprised at how rapidly that this child would cease to have a problem with mathematics, because not only is it the physical teaching and what the child or the youth sees in mathematics, but it allows the consciousness or soul that is in us to link with the soul of the one that is beyond the realm of the physical. I'm very well aware of this because I had at a very young age left high school, and I decided finally that I needed to get a college education. So I went to get my GED, and at the same time I decided to try and see if I could qualify for college. And I failed about 0.2% in mathematics. So the person who was doing the testing, knowing that I wanted so badly to get into college, said, I will give you 2 weeks to see if you can raise the score of your mathematics suitable enough for you to enter college, because I had passed all my other college entrance exams. So I went out and I ate with mathematics, worked mathematics. I did nothing for 2 weeks but to live, breathe, and eat mathematics. When I went back to take my test again, my college entrance exam, I passed with a score of 165, which is classified, or was classified in those days, as genius level. And I did that in 2 weeks. I didn't understand why it worked. I only understood somehow the intensity of this. I learned it through living and breathing it. And so it is with all things. We can make things so much easier if we but understood that it isn't the brain which thinks, but it is the soul using the brain as an instrument. And that this soul is connected with the souls of every soul who has ever been born. And that we have at our fingertips the wealth of universal knowledge, if we will but reach for it. When I want a new recipe, I don't have to go to a recipe book. I just think over the spices and the herbs and what goes together. Up here, it's just like reaching up and pulling it right down. And suddenly a new recipe is born. Well, that's enough of this. It will give you an idea that we have within us the capabilities of improving our mind and having tools by which we can do this, so that we, and I'm using this only as one of the tools, because in training the way we think, we're so accustomed to thinking in a negative manner that it's going to take us time and patience and perseverance. I have been at this for 26 years, so I know this is not an easy task, but it's well worth it, because the world around you gets so magical. And everyone's life who you touch, well, somehow they're magical too. And so I want now to introduce you to just a few books This one here is not necessarily one that I recommend reading, but I'm sure that perhaps some of you will be interested. If you remember in the very beginning when I had the book stacked out here, we talked about some of the multi-sources that were available on Jesus' life. We also mentioned that the early church fathers, and we're talking about the early bishops in the first, the second, and third centuries, that felt that they had been consecrated by Jesus to carry on the work of the Master, and that their consecration was direct, and that it was in the third century, in Constantine's time, when he pulled the bishops in with the powerful Arians, and they argued on the floor of Constantinople what would be the ruling religion of Asia. Constantine did not want a house divided. So the Arians, of course, lost and the bishops won. And it was from that time that the teachings went on to become very secret teachings of Christianity. Teachings that were never again allowed out to the catechumens or to, shall we say, to mass consciousness. And people like Tertullian and St. Augustine and St. Ambrose were all part of this wondrous original Christianity that came in those first 2 or 3 centuries. This is a book on called The Last Transfiguration, and I have many other books, by the way, in my library on St. Augustine. He was, of course, very prolific in his opinions, but I pulled this one out simply because it mentions in here that one of his great heroes, of course, and one that was to be responsible for converting him to Christianity, ultimately was, of course, St. Ambrose. I don't think they were known as saints in those days. That kind of came along later with the forming of the Roman Vatican. But you might be interested to know that St. Augustine went the path that many people went. In other words, he'd read everything. He studied all of the mysteries from a very young age, and he spent 9 years as a Manichaean, which he liked very much because that kind of allowed him to do what he wanted to do without getting into too much trouble and still feel that he was on the spiritual path. And that should remind you of not just our Western world, but many people in the world today. We want to feel we're kind of going a spiritual or religious path, but we don't want to change our lives too much. And so we kind of stay on the outside fringes of this. Well, that's what St. Augustine did during the young years of his life. Finally, when he came across the Neoplatonism, and of course that was Plato's teaching. Plato was a student, disciple of Socrates. And we're talking about people that existed before Jesus, of course, lived on earth. And Socrates was a very great philosopher in the sense that he made people go inside. He would ask penetrating questions, and in finding the answer, the person or people would see what they were really like. Many couldn't stand this. And so, of course, as we know, Socrates was compelled or forced to drink the poison hemlock. So Socrates' his primary disciple, who had come the last 3 years of Socrates' life, was Plato, who actually became greater in the light than what Socrates did, perhaps because of longevity of life, because he also had Socrates' knowledge plus his own experiences. Well, the primary disciple of Plato was, of course, the great intellect, who was Aristotle. Aristotle kind of modified the teachings of Plato because he had, of course, the teachings of his teacher plus his precept or perception of what his teacher taught. This became known as Neoplatonism and was in the early years of Christianity, in the time when St. Augustine lived, was a very common among the what we call the Christian intellects. So after Augustine had studied so many of the philosophies and sciences, he's finally caught up by Symmachus, who was a cousin to St. Ambrose. which led him ultimately to accept Christianity. And Christianity, to him, he saw that Jesus was the persona, the personification of God upon earth. That in Jesus he saw all things that mankind could become. So he said that, he talked about his own entrance into transformational change, which we will discuss so much more fully when we go into the Via Dolorosa. I entered, and with the eye of my soul, such as it was, I saw the light that never changes, casting its rays over the same eye of my soul, over my mind. It was not the common light of day, nor was it more spacious light of some sort. What I saw was something quite different from any light we know on earth. It shone above my mind. It was above me because it was itself the light that made me, and I was below because I was made from it. And this is called the illumined mind, at that time when the soul opens and resurrects from the dead the great Christ consciousness that is within it. And so we are made by it, and we are below it because we are made by it. So that was finally the thing that he had sought for so much, which was the illumined state of mind, which had been promised him by the Manichaeans. He saw his first faint glimmers in Neoplatonism and went on to finally to the full realization of the light under the teachings of Christ. Now, what are some of the things that he might have studied? You see, Jesus, when I found out that he had traveled in Egypt and India, there was nothing I could do but also to go to India. I had to find out what he experienced. I had to see the land myself, because how could I possibly understand Jesus' teachings if I could not understand the foundation of them? In other words, to experience what he had experienced. I still have an old adage that everything Jesus did, I've tried, including walking on water. Only one difference between Jesus and I, and that is I sink and he didn't. But one of the great masters that was about the same time as Moses, and by the way, Moses was a tremendous master. He reached this illumined state of mind and passed through the resurrection of the dead journey in the Great Sinai Desert. He illumined on the mount. He saw God, he talked to God, and became then the emissary and reflection of God. I think if anyone has ever read the great speech that he gave at the mutiny of Paran, they would never doubt the brilliancy and genius of Moses. Well, it is said that Egypt produced two great masters. One of them was Moses, and when we speak of masters, ones who have mastered their lives, ones who have become one with God, who have passed through the resurrection of the dead, or the dark night of the soul. And so the other one was Hermes. And believe me, I have many more books than this one on Hermes also, because if there was any chance that Jesus might have perused these, I perused them. So I have tried to study the wisdom of the world. This is just an example of a touch of Hermetics. We are prone sometimes to think in our search for truth that it can only exist one place. But the truth that we know has been built stone by stone for over 6,000 years. And for us to come into the fullness, we must understand all that has passed and then add to it our knowledge of modern time. Holy art thou, O God, the universal Father. Holy art thou, O God, who will perfects itself by the means of its own power. Holy art thou, O God, who will be known and are known by those by thy own, meaning those who have reached for God will see God. Jesus spoke of this when in the scriptures, the pure of heart, they will see God. Doesn't mean that we have to be pure, only our love pure. In the eye of a simple human being with all of the mortal characteristics of everyone else, I have seen God. And Jesus has appeared to me many times. So, holy art thou who did by your word make all things that are. And holy art thou whom all nature has been made in image. And from this we know, as Jesus taught that the earthly mother was a reflection of the Heavenly Father, he teaches this in the Gospel of Peace, that earth is an image of God. And now we're finding that Hermes, who existed, I don't know just what the variance in time between Moses and Hermes was, but we find that way back in Egypt, it was taught that earth was a reflection of God. Then everything that is on earth must be a cell in the body of God, including ourselves. Holy are you, more powerful than all power, and holy are you, that you're better than all praise. And he asked that God accept his reasonings, and that he stretched his soul and his heart and his eyes up to God. He said, thou unutterable, unspeakable, whose name only the silence can't express. Can we call such teachings as this the work of paganism? That which teaches us how to love God? Whenever I read a great work, it's for one reason: to better understand the nature of God. I think I've already mentioned to you that the first time I saw Jesus, when he appeared to me, I had only one question to ask him. And I don't know what most people would have asked, but I am always, when I talk to my students about this, I'm always amused by it myself. And that is, I had one question, and here's Jesus. I've never seen him before, and he appears. I've been taken to him, and I'm in his presence, and all I can ask him, is your Father coming? And I remember the amusement in Jesus' eyes when he said, my Father will come later. And I know that it was through his touch that I was able to experience the fullness of God, and it is wonderful. This other one is Pythagoras. I think Pythagoras was probably the greatest philosopher of all time. I like his work better than Plato. And we're not trying to get intellectual here. I'm trying to show you some of the material that we can read that will expand our understanding of God. That is not to say that if you didn't live precisely as the Bible tells you to live, that you wouldn't experience it. Because it was certainly Jesus' first commandment that enabled me to open that doorway. And that was to love God, and then next love each other. Just an example of the golden verses of Pythagoras. Even as truth does error have its lovers. With prudence the philosopher approves or blames. If error triumphs, he departs and waits. So we're saying here that truth has its lovers, but there are also lovers of errors, meaning that rather than to perceive truth, which may make us change our way of thinking, we are prone to hang on to the errors of our way. For instance, there are people who still believe that the sun and moon came after earth was formed, because that's the way it is in King James Bible. It's not that way in original Genesis of Hebrew, but that's the way it is in King James, so sun and moon had to come after earth. Well, it didn't. The earth came from the sun. So the sun existed long before earth did. So, but we hang on to this. We don't try to seek the reason why it was written that way. It might be that the light of day had nothing to do with the light, with the sunlight at all. It might have been the light of consciousness which would bring forth all creation came first. It might be that great light which is day, and that darkness is that of earth and unknowing. So he separated light and darkness, the light of consciousness from the darkness of mortality. Again, a variance of understanding, phraseology between a Christian mystic and maybe we might say traditional Christianity. With prudence, the philosopher approves or blames, meaning that as a philosopher, one's going to look deeply into why someone does that thing. When we condemn someone, do we ever stop to try to understand why they are that way? Do we understand that that person who is running a jackhammer, who everybody shies away from because he makes so much noise, is the man that helped to build these great cities. And that we cannot look at the man at the jackhammer without seeing the magnificence of the cities that cross this world. Tired, sweat, hot, noisy. Sometimes they become deaf. Do we ever have compassion, or do we just run away because he's making too much noise? The philosopher sits and thinks and tries to understand why they feel that way inside. And most of all, why this person is that way. I've never met a person that a kind smile and an understanding touch has not changed from darkness to light, from sadness and despair to happiness. If error triumphs, then a person just departs and waits for another time of truth. Well, that's just one little phrase out of the golden verses of Pythagoras, and I chose Pythagoras probably because he came about the same time as Moses. By the way, this was translated by Fabre d'Olivet, another one of the great illumined minds, and the one who translated the original Hebrew of Moses. Well, we are coming to an end, I see, by our time element on what we would classify the peace with the mind. And so I just want to touch the Essene Code of Life. This Essene Code of Life is just is a translation of a discourse that took place between Banus and Essene Master on Josephus, who was the great Jewish historian and also the great military general. It happened to be that Josephus went and studied with Banus 3 years when he was in his prime. And he speaks about this, by the way, in the Jewish War in the Antiquities. And we understand he had tremendous affection for the Essenes. Josephus asked Banus to talk about the 10 essentials of God. Remember, Jesus was an Essene till he was 19. So Banus said that God is primordial. He is first. He came before all things. That he is immediate. That we have immediate access to God any moment, any time, anywhere. In the middle of the desert, in the middle of Main Street. So that whenever we have a problem, we have but need to stop and to ask. That God is universal means that God loves everybody in this world the same. With God there are no religions, there are no philosophies, there isn't any science versus religion, because God is the primordial and first of all things. He is the originator of science in the sense that all things come from him. The study of nature, which is science, that is a suit of clothes which God wears. So how can we separate religion and science? He is, of course, certainly in our immediacy, we not only do we have this communication, but his universality brings to us always oneness between cultures. What difference does it make if one is a Christian and one is a Buddhist? To God there are no Christians and Buddha. They are all his children. Buddhists, Jesus, Pythagoras, Plato, Socrates, Zarathustra. These were all his world teachers. Teachers that taught their followers about him. So no separation. And we must find that path if we are to become one with God and one with all mankind. So Jesus said, after this manner, therefore, pray to your heavenly Father when the sun is high at midday. Our Father, who art in heaven, send to all the sons of men your angel of peace, and send to our thoughts the angel of power, that we may break the bonds of death. I'll be with you next week. Thank you for being with us. We are a Christian Church of Universal Peace, School of the Mysteries. We know that you might have questions. We want you to feel free to call us at area code 206-362-4134. That's area code 206-362-4134. Or join us at our website, www.mysteryschool.org. The God in me bows to the God in you, and may heaven walk with you all week.